How can you write about OSU and not write about athletics? Yes, I wrote a chapter about athletics. My chapter is unusual. Unusual in the sense that there are so many books about individual sports, football, basketball, or biographies of star athletes. I wanted to avoid all that, but really wanted to focus more on how it was that athletics became such an important part of our institutional culture. The quote that, I have two quotes that begin this chapter. This is from William Henry Scott, the Methodist minister. Quote, another evil that attends the present system of athletics is its interference with university work. This is especially true of intercollegiate athletics, 1890. Counter that, however, with the vision statement endorsed by the university in 2001. Our intercollegiate athletic programs will routinely rank among the elite few. So, you know, how does this happen? Very early on, athletics is strictly a student event or engagement. And let me read this couple of paragraphs here. While student publications such as the Lantern and the Macchio embraced athletics as a virtue, official support developed slowly. Some professors saw athletics as harmless, even useful play, and participated as judges of athletic contests. Some even contributed financially to the Student Athletic Association. Others, however, feared that athletics would distract from and even interfere with academics. In 1890, President Scott, for one, acknowledged the importance of cheerful and hearty physical exercise, such as lawn tennis, but had doubts about football and intercollegiate athletics generally, sports that involve practices during the school week and caused participants to neglect their academic studies were harmful. Quote, we have great confidence in the loyalty and earnestness of our students. Some of the most loyal and earnest are members of the various teams, and others are zealous friends and supporters of the association, as the Student Athletic Association. Yet the history of athletics in the Eastern colleges and the manifest tendency of those of Ohio indicate that some limits should be prescribed. Nevertheless, enthusiasm for athletics spread across campuses in Ohio, even as it had sprung from the East originally. During the 1880s and 1890s, OSU competed against such schools as Western Reserve, Case Institute, Worcester, Akron, Oberlin, Otterbein, Kenyon, Ohio Wesleyan, Cincinnati, and Denison. From time to time, presidents voiced concerns about sporting events that involved players who were not students and about profanity, betting, and payments for performance. To regulate competition and to assure propriety, presidents organized the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of Ohio. However, students resisted rules imposed by presidents and faculty. In fact, an editorial in OSU's Lantern declared that it was, quote, it was hideous in the extreme that faculty should think that they could grant or deny participation in athletics as a privilege to students. So you see the conflict between the students and the university. The university is quite concerned about the improprieties, about the university getting bad recognition, plus, of course, the interference with academics. Things come to a major head when the Student Athletic Association is bankrupt and is in such bad state organizationally that they can't even find their constitution. And at that point, the students are told that permission to use the grounds for athletic purposes will only be granted when there is, in fact, an athletic association that represents students but is also controlled by faculty. That's the beginning of university engagement, official engagement in athletics, and it's one that would develop into the Western university's membership into the Western Athletic Conference, now known as the Big Ten. That's one story in this chapter. The other story there are two other stories actually. One is the periodic concern about the growth of athletics versus the priorities for academics on campus. And the chapter talks about two major events. One was the Fullington Commission in 1954, which spent 30 months, faculty committee, reviewing the status of athletics and had some major recommendations for the status of athletes and university engagement. The other was the Rose Bowl incident of 1961. That was the incident where the faculty athletic council voted not to accept the invitation to the Rose Bowl. It looms large not only because of the extraordinary event, but there was a fear among some people that the Board of Trustees would overrule the faculty. And if that happened, the whole principle of faculty control over athletics would have been threatened. Fortunately, the trustees accepted that decision not to participate in the Rose Bowl. The final section of this chapter has to do with women's athletics, which is a very different story. The women's athletics, for up until about 1950, the theme in women's athletics is physical recreation, purposes of health, but the nature of intercollegiate competition, of competing for the purpose of winning, as opposed to comradeship, athletic skills. You know, this is a concept that the public, that part of the public refuses to accept, and it's one that only develops after World War II and receives final recognition especially with Title IX, but even before Title IX, in persona of someone like Phyllis Bailey, who establishes women's athletics on par with men's athletics. So three different stories going on within that chapter. I have a relatively brief chapter about traditions. As I said in my preface, people feel differently about what's important to the university. Certainly, the traditions are part of the color. I wanted to look not only at individual traditions, but also in those traditions with which we are familiar, but also some of the ones that, in some cases, thankfully, are no longer around. But I was looking for a quote to lead off this chapter. I found one in a source that librarians, fellow librarians would appreciate, Bartlett's familiar quotations. This is from Friedrich Nietzsche. Every tradition grows ever more venerable. The more remote its origin, the more confused that origin is. The reverence due to it increases from generation to generation. The tradition finally becomes holy and inspires awe. There's a little paragraph on traditions. People have disagreed about the value of campus traditions. David Starr Jordan, when president of Stanford University, called them, quote, the greatest instruments of culture in college, end quote. However, Woodrow Wilson, when president of Princeton University, is said to have remarked, quote, these sideshows have ruined the business of the big tent. In 1929, OSU Lantern expressed regret that the university was losing one of its oldest traditions, the cane rush. There's quite a few pages on the cane rush, which was a bizarre tradition. Lantern said, we are sorry indeed to see another of Ohio State's old and memorable traditions go into oblivion, as have many others which were strictly observed, end quote. A few days later, however, the Lantern published a letter from a student who challenged the value of traditions. Keep in mind, this is the 1930s, and this was a time when many traditions were challenged. Quote, we represent an age that is done with the sentimental customs of past. Why should we continue on the Ohio State campus the more or less silly ideas of our predecessors? End of quote. Nevertheless, traditions are part of campus life, and anybody who's seen commencement in the robes and hoods of many colors will agree that they add significantly to the color and pageantry of campus life. I have another chapter, chapter 8, which talks about the development of the physical campus. from farm to OSU campus. Begins with a quote from Professor Charles Chubb. I'll get into him in a minute. Quote, "College years are the closing years of the most receptive period of life." This was said in 1910. It's still apt today. "Let us send out our graduates into the busy walks of life with the undying memory of a beautiful university, with an insatiate desire to come back every year at commencement with her good classmates, to renew the friendship of her wide lawns, her shaded walks, and her splendid halls." Rather nicely put. The story of how OSU grew from farm to a mega campus is more than simply counting the buildings and acreage. Fundamentally, it was and continues to be the work of people who had ideas about what a successful university should look like in the layout of the campus. At many times in its history, OSU engaged trustees, architects, staff, and community groups in its planning efforts. Sometimes plans changed to reflect differing visions of a learning environment. Ultimately, the goal has always been to create a campus that is functional in meeting the diverse needs of a large institution and has memorable spaces and places that inspire, that welcomes solitary scholarship and contemplation, and also has picturesque opportunities for people to gather and exchange ideas. Much of this chapter deals with the history of the planning process. In the early planning process, we relied heavily on trustees hired Herman Heyerling, who was a landscape architect in Cincinnati, who specialized in doing cemeteries. Cemeteries were the way landscape architects made a living. So it was not unusual. Of course, the people who were really big name were the Olmsted brothers, and the Olmsted brothers were brought to campus by the trustees. One of their missions was to find a site for this library. Let me read a bit. The Olmsted brothers recommended that the trustees develop the campus more systematically by earmarking areas for different studies or services. Within those areas, the university should erect buildings that were formal and large. I should mention, in way of context, the previous concept was that the university would be a small village with buildings informal and scattered about. Open lawns or green space should be identified in advance and protected from planning for new buildings. Quote, "Keep permanently free from buildings a grand central lawn westerly from and perpendicular to High Street, starting at the proposed grand entrance at 15th Avenue and ending at the proposed Great Library on the hill," this place, south of University Hall. The width of the central lawn may be different at different places, but it should eventually be symmetrical or nearly so. This wasn't the first time that this green space had been identified as a planning element. The Packard and Associates had done this in the 1890s. Professor Chubb of architecture, whom I quoted early in this chapter, was a remarkably acerbic but influential individual. He was highly critical of much of the Olmsted Brothers report. He thought that University Hall was an ugly building that was built in the worst period of American architecture, which we referred to as the United States spirit of 1870. Also, Chubb called for the eventual demolition of Hayes Hall, now one of OSU's architectural landmarks, which he described as an unsightly building. In general, Chubb despaired of the OSU campus, quote, "I have now, like a doctor to his despairing patient, told you that our poor campus has most known architectural diseases." So he's extremely critical. He's also extremely influential because he makes the case that this campus is too large not to have its own university architect, particularly with the building of the campus. And in fact, the first architect, Joseph Bradford, is hired with Chubb serving on an advisory committee. So this talks about the entire planning process, including plans that didn't come to fruition. My chapter 9 is an overview of special places on the campus, covers all the historic buildings and such sites as the Oval, Mirror Lake Hollow, and begins with another quote, this time from Marcel Proust, remembrance of things past. The places we have known do not only belong to the world of space in which we situate them for the sake of simplicity. In other words, there's an emotive quality to physical space. As a campus, the Ohio State University has special places, buildings and spaces that inspire and linger in memory and that make the campus both unique and attractive. Knowing these places, landmarks that they are, is a fundamental part of the campus experience. Learning about their history, how they began, how they changed, helps one appreciate these places even more.